I take seriously the idea that there's a possibility that we are dealing with some kind of intelligence within the DMT space specifically, not just necessarily the DMT space, but also with other, psilocybin, for example. But I don't completely dismiss the idea of there is some other intelligence there, some other conscious intelligence, autonomous, that we are actually in communication with. Now, the nature of that, the origin of that, the relationship between us and that intelligence is completely unclear. We don't know anything about that. But I don't dismiss that we could be dealing with an intelligence like that. And so my interest is in kind of establishing what we're dealing with when we burst through into this domain.
Have you ever wondered if your company is maximizing the return of your data investment? Are you collecting the right data required to make informed decisions? Is there more that can be learned from our data? Koyas Institute can answer these questions and help you discover the hidden value within your data sets by utilizing a well-rounded approach to data analysis. Stop leaving value behind and start increasing the return on your data investment. The next generation of data analysis has begun. We are pioneers in pattern discovery. We are Koyas Institute.
The actual breakthrough period when you're actually within, you've having kind of broken through into this alternate reality, this alternate world space, you're normally in there 5 to 7, maybe a bit longer minutes. It's not very long at all. So by the time you've kind of got over the shock and the astonishment and got your bearings and oriented yourself within the space, you're already kind of on the way out.
Coming down, yeah.
And for most people, that's it's more than enough. But if you really want to explore and analyze and establish communication with the beings within this space, then 5 minutes just isn't enough time. It's you're dipping your toes in the water, really. A bit more than that. I mean, you're going deep into the space for sure, but just for not very, very long, basically. So the Imperial College project or research project, I'm not actually directly involved with it, by the way. It's certainly, I'm not, collaborating. I'm not part of their team. My connection to it, what's come to be known as DMTX, the extended state DMT, goes back to 2016, when it occurred to me that we have a technology for maintaining a stable brain concentration of a drug, short-acting drug, in anesthesiology. So when they put you to sleep, if you go under a general anesthetic, what they will do is they will infuse a very short-acting anesthetic into your bloodstream at a programmed rate based upon the metabolism and excretion rate and distribution rate of a particular drug. And when they do that with this infusion, is they maintain this fairly stable brain anesthetic drug concentration, so they can hold you in the anesthetized state. So you're not at the mercy of the regular kind of time course of drug. It goes up into the brain, then it peaks, then it comes down again. Obviously, that's no good if you want to keep someone asleep for, could be 2, 3, 4, 5 hours, depending on the operation, right? So you have this technology, and this has been developed for decades now. It's called target-controlled intravenous infusion, target being the brain. So you're controlling the concentration in the brain over time. So it occurred to me, well, this is precisely the technology that we need. Let's just repurpose it for DMT. Let's, instead of injecting an anesthetic, and inject DMT. Now it's a simple idea, of course, but it's slightly more difficult in practice, because you need to have a specific sort of pharmacokinetic model of the drug, and that will vary depending on the drug. So, how quickly does it reach the brain? How quickly is it metabolized and excreted? all these things. These are all drug specific, so you need to calculate it for each drug, basically. So that allows you then to get the programmed infusion right so that the brain level remains constant. So I had the idea, I just needed some blood concentration data. So in other words, I need the concentration of DMT in someone's blood over time if you just inject them with DMT. And I knew that Rick Strassman had that data at some point because he published it, after his 1990s, his pioneering study. I knew he took that data. I knew he was taking blood samples, intervals, and measuring the DMT concentration in the blood. So I emailed Rick way back it might have even been in 2015, and said, do you have this data? I have this idea. I want to work on this. He did fortunately have the data. This was a long time ago, right? This is like getting more than 2 decades ago. But fortunately, he still had the data, the raw data. So he sent that to me. I did the mathematical modeling, developing the pharmacokinetic model, developed this protocol for use in humans. And then we published this in a paper in 2016. And that became the basis for these DMTX projects. The Imperial College is just completed a kind of pilot study with, I think, about 10 or 11 subjects, just to check that it's tolerable, that it's not dangerous, that people can manage it. And they did a sort of a 30 minutes duration. But there's a team in Basel as well who are doing 90 minutes, so just starting a 90-minute study now. So it's kind of taking off, basically. So this is the technology that would allow you to suspend much more time within the DMT space, to allow the state to stabilize somewhat so that you can then perform more formal analyses and explorations and establish communication with the beings and all that kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm. I would like to ask you, in your opinion, on the wider implications of these substances being made illegal for so many years, what kind of effect this may have had on our society due to their absence?
Well, I mean, that's a very broad and very almost philosophical question you're getting into.
You've come into a philosophical corner of YouTube. Prepare for that.
Well, okay, let's start with something slightly more grounded. I mean, clearly, what we're starting to see over the last decade is the potential for almost revolutionary value of psychedelics in the treatment of neuropsychiatric conditions, right? Depression, anxiety, trauma, post-traumatic stress disorder, and probably many more, anorexia, you name it. Psychedelics seem to have a powerful role there, a drug that you can give once, twice, maybe 3 times, but a small number of times, and the individual, the patient who's suffering from this often debilitating neuropsychological condition finds great relief, and this is, extended for many months, if not longer. So this is revolutionary, and we've seen that potential within the last decade, really. And so if you imagine if that research was being done since the mid-60s or something, 70s, where we would be now, how many lives would have been affected, how many lives would have been saved, really, if you think of the number of suicides that have resulted from treatment-resistant depression, right? So people with treatment-resistant depression, they've tried all the SSRIs, they've tried the tricyclics, they've tried all the different classes of antidepressants, and yet they still are deeply depressed. I mean, often it's like, what's the next step? The next step is to exit, is to commit suicide. And psychedelics are showing remarkable effects in these kind of patients. So the psychedelic dark age, I think, was truly a dark age for research. From a clinical, the well-being of the public, it's been a disaster, I think. Now, aside from that, if you think about psychedelics from a not a therapeutic perspective, but I mean, what I'm interested in, for example, I mean, I sit at the extreme of what people think about psychedelics. I'm not at the extreme, but certainly I entertain ideas and possibilities that many kind of more orthodox neuroscientists and other types of scientists, I go to places that others dare not tread for fear of losing respectability or something.
Would you say that you wander down the same path as someone like Terence McKenna, for example?
Well, I wish I could, I wish I was as smart as Terence McKenna.
I think we all wish we were as smart as Terence McKenna.
I wish I was as well read as Terence McKenna.
He was a poet. He was a real poet.
He really was. But yes, I mean, I take seriously the idea that there's a possibility that we are dealing with some kind of intelligence within the DMT space specifically, not just necessarily the DMT space, but also with other, psilocybin, for example. But I don't completely dismiss the idea of there is some other intelligence there, some other conscious intelligence, autonomous, that we are actually in communication with. Now, the nature of that, the origin of that, the relationship between us and that intelligence is completely unclear. We don't know anything about that. But I don't dismiss that we could be dealing with an intelligence like that. And so my interest is in kind of establishing what we're dealing with when we burst through into this domain. And I think had DMT, this kind of research that's being done now at Imperial, been started in the 1970s, then we might be living in an entirely different world, at the extreme, right? Let's imagine that we are really dealing with some kind of intelligence from some other place, or some other part of us even, who knows? But, that would be a transcendentally transformative discovery. It would be the most important discovery in the history of humankind, that we could actually communicate with some other intelligence that's not only not within this, not only kind of not on Earth, but not within this universe, not within this space-time, or something like that. That would be, that blows everything else out of the water in terms of important discoveries, right? That's kind of contact to the next level, it's almost unimaginable, unthinkable for most people that could be achievable. So we could be living in a world, if this DMTX research was going on in the 1970s, where we would have been kind of communicating and coexisting with intelligences from some other reality for decades, so it's hard to imagine what that would be like and what effect it would have had on human civilization with that realization. So, but
I guess a case study is the groups in the Amazon basin that are just sitting there communing with dimensional entities for hundreds and thousands of years, and they found an equilibrium with nature, an equilibrium with the environment, whereas we just kind of pillage and tear and destroy and don't think about the generational consequences of our actions. So there's certainly, I would say, an equilibrious effect to these things if they're taken en masse that allows humanity to settle down a little bit. And we just don't have access to that type of a catalyst in the West.
Yeah, I mean, that's possible. I mean, it is interesting to imagine. I mean, yes, with these sort of indigenous groups in South America, for example, who take for granted that they're dealing with, for them it's perfectly obvious that they're dealing with some other intelligence, and they coexist and they communicate, and they, with these beings. It's difficult to imagine how that would translate a human civilization, modern 21st century Western society would be living out that relationship with some other hyperdimensional intelligence.
So sometimes I wonder, I'm about to take it down a very strange route, but sometimes I wonder if that's what the UFO issue represents to a certain degree. It's almost like the technological version of the psychedelic entity, something that does seem to exist on the borderlines between reality and another space that we're unaware of, that has these abilities to traverse through. And when you take psychedelics, there's a lot of overlap and overlay between proposed UFO experiences. So I know I'm taking it down a pretty kind of speculative path, but I just find it interesting. It's almost like, here's the antidote for the technological, analytical Westerner, a flying saucer that acts like a psychedelic.
Yeah, I mean, I think it was Jacques Vallée who said something like, if this turns out to just be nuts and bolts,
I'll be very disappointed.
I'll be very disappointed, yeah. And you know, it doesn't, it seems to be far more complicated and far stranger than that, just the UFO phenomenon. And John Mack appreciated that.
Yeah.
That was the late great Harvard psychiatrist, interviewed and put under hypnotic regression all of these abductees, of course. And, you know, he was no slouch academically by any stretch of the imagination. He was no idiot. You know, he knew people, you know, he knew liars, he knew psychotics, he knew people who were deluded or suffering from hallucinatory episodes. So he clearly knew there was something going on there. And he also later on came to accept this was not some normal physical phenomenon where these beings were kind of landing on the lawn and then creeping in through the front window and plucking them from their bed and carrying them into the craft. But actually this was something that could often seem to be happening outside of the normal, kind of our normal three-dimensional world. And there was some relationship to alterations in consciousness and that kind of thing. So immediately you think about our DMT, that is exactly what seems to be happening with DMT, is you seem to be entering some alien space, you know, some alternate reality that's populated by what often are these extremely intelligent, highly advanced, highly cognitive and technologically sophisticated beings, which look like they've undergone a vast period of both biological, post-biological, technological evolution, and are in a state, you know, like we might be in a million years, basically.
Right.
You know, in a state that we can't even comprehend at this current time.
It makes me, I was going to get into this a little bit later, but you're making my brain fire off in this particular direction. I'm just thinking of the kind of amalgamation that's building between quantum computers and artificial intelligence, and is the psychedelic space a window into some sort of post-singularity existence that we can't even really imagine until it happens to us?
Yeah, I think it seems like that, you know? I mean, intelligence is something that increases as it can. This is, I forget whose principle, I forget who it was who said it, but it's called the intelligence principle, basically, that if intelligence can be increased, it will be.
It will be.
It will be, you know, and if you meet a being that's a million years more advanced than us, who's made it that far, it will be vastly more intelligent than us, you know, and all of the trimmings, all of the kind of the machinations of an inordinately more advanced than us civilization, everything there. So you can't help but feeling when you burst into the DMT space, it has this, even if you don't see any kind of entities as such, immediately, certainly for me and for many other people, it's immediately obvious that this is a constructed space, and not just constructed by any old being. This is a space that's been, you know, built by the hand of an astonishingly advanced intelligence, one that is far, far beyond anything that we could even comprehend, let alone kind of explain and make sense of. It's just burst. You're in that place. You know then that you're in the presence of vast, immense, profound intelligence.
Yeah, I remember I was listening to a lecture by Terence McKenna where he spoke about introducing a pretty highly placed Buddhist monk to DMT for the first time. And once this monk came back from, and I love it because, you know, he says, and he sat there and he took it like a trooper, and he just, you know, just sat there, closed his eyes, picked up the pipe. But he said that when this Buddhist monk came back from that experience, he said that those were the lesser lights of the bardo, which in Buddhist theology is essentially the boundary line between our world and the worlds beyond it. That this is as far as you can go from your body and from this physical dimension while still being able to return. So it's a very similar type of idea of bursting into a phenomenally powerful and different space. Do you think that this is in some way suggestive of what a physicist would say, that we are potentially in a simulation?
Simulation implies, in my rendering of the term, my understanding of the term, a simulation requires a simulated. In other words, if you have a simulation, then you must have the real counterpart.
Uh-huh.
You know what I mean?
Yeah. And then the argument becomes, is it the simulation of a simulation of a simulation of it? Like what?
Right, exactly.
Where's the universe one?
Yes, exactly. So a simulation, there must always be a simulation of something. Otherwise, it's not a simulation, it's an instantiation. So just because our world, for example, if we discover that our world is digital, the ground of reality, this idea of this digital physics, Stephen Wolfram into this, and Ed Fredkin was the kind of the father of digital physics. And of course, the simulationists, anyway, those people who believe in the simulation, they think that's great evidence that, if the universe is discrete at the lowest level, it is computationally generated, it's computing itself, that's evidence for a simulation. No, that's evidence that the universe is computational, that it's digital, but it doesn't mean that it's a simulation. So, for example, I could, let's say I wrote some code and generated a form of life on a computer, digital life that was actually living, that passed all the requirements for life. Well, would that be a simulation of life? Well, no, it would be an instantiation of life.
Right.
Unless I was saying, okay, let's simulate a rat. Yes. And then I might try and replicate the behavior and the physiology, etc., of a rat. Then that would be a simulation, because you have the real rat that I'm simulating. So scientists, I'm a computational neurobiologist. I simulate very small parts of the brain. So I'm simulating a neuron, right? Trying to replicate its behavior so that I can kind of perturb it and probe it to try and understand it. But I'm simulating. There's always a real counterpart there. So to say that we're simulated, to get back to the original point, suggests that there is a real version of us. But I don't think that's really necessary. I don't see that that's the only option anyway. I still think that we could be fundamentally constructed or emerging from some information structure in the ground of reality, even some code that's been written by some alien hyper-intelligence, but that wouldn't make us a simulation. It would just make us some kind of instantiation of life. But yes, it does feel like, I've certainly had experiences where it feels like, and many other people have, feels like you're entering the domain of the programmer, the grand program.
Yeah.
Right. And so yeah, whether you call it simulation or not, it does sometimes feel like that we are this lower dimensional instantiation of emergent life. And when you go into the DMT space, you are entering this higher dimension.
Yeah, another rung up the evolutionary ladder in quite a grand scale.
Yes, exactly. It's also interesting that the DMT space is often described as having more dimensions. People describe it has an impossible geometry, an impossible dimensionality to it. Dimensions exist that can't exist in our reality, which suggests that our reality could be a slice, a lower dimensional slice of this larger structure. This is what I discuss in detail in my first book, Alien Information Theory. It's the idea that we exist within this lower dimensional slice of this high dimensional structure.
Right.
DMT allows you to experience this high dimensional structure. So you break through into the full domain, if you like, out of your slice and into the realm where these grand intelligences reside.
Well, this speculate. Yeah, but it's fantastic speculation, and I don't think it's completely bereft of logic either, because we know that everything we call solid matter is ultimately just bundles of energy spinning, vibrating, oscillating at such speeds that they're, in essence, generating the illusion of solidity. We know that the photon and the electron can collapse into particle form when it's being observed, but when unobserved, it can expand into a wave of energy. and we see the mathematical coding and geometric patterns that repeat across the natural world, from pi to the golden ratio. And when people take substances like DMT or psilocybin, they can begin to see these underlying geometrics of reality, the same geometric forms that are echoed in ancient symbology. Religions all across the world incorporate geometry into their artwork, into their architecture. And now our physicists are discovering these same geometric forms at the energetic foundations of our universe. So it feels to me that lurking within all of this geometric coding that can be experienced consciously through psychedelics, technologically through physics and simulation, and can be referenced historically through our theology, there's a deep, profound set of answers here to some important questions about reality and about consciousness.
Absolutely, yeah. I think it's like there are clues everywhere you look, you know?
Right.
And DMT, I've often thought of DMT as being like this message, this hidden message that's kind of embedded into our reality. It's this simple plant alkaloid. It's everywhere you look. You know, Dennis McKenna always says nature is drenched in DMT. It's everywhere you look. You look out your window, there's probably half a dozen plants that contain DMT. It's in citrus fruit. It's everywhere. Not in high concentrations, so don't go extracting orange peel because you won't get much DMT. But it's everywhere you look. But it's meaningless unless you have the cognitive sophistication to identify it, to isolate it, and then to learn how to use it. It's like this intelligence test, this indecipherable message that no one, unless you're very highly intelligent and advanced like humans are relative to other animals, it's a message that would fly by. You wouldn't see it. It's not that, but we've reached this level in our cognitive evolution that we've stumbled across this message, and it's a message that unfolds in your brain. It's a perfect way to send a message, is to stimulate brain activity in a certain way such that you actually access this alternate domain. You know, it doesn't have to be written on tablets or something like that. You know,
right.
It's something that you deliver directly into the brain.
Well, they say the experience is the greatest teacher, and I think that's absolutely true. When you have self-realization or self-experience, that can be the most significant accelerant for change.
Yeah, I think I've always thought that if you want to, this idea that if you want to communicate with, if you want to send a message to an intelligence in another star system, what you should do is perhaps send not necessarily a molecule, but instructions, the construction of a molecule that, when they consumed, would perturb their neurochemistry and their neuroactivity in such a way that they would experience the Earth or something like that.
Yeah. Could the ultimate alien artifact actually be DMT? Is that the alien?
Exactly.
Yeah.
So we don't know how to do that, of course. We can't stimulate someone's brain to cause them to see human life or anything like that. But you can imagine that.
I don't know, bro. Ask the CIA. They've got some pretty cool stuff hidden away. Don't know what they might be capable of.
Yeah, well, apart from the CIA, I think. But yeah, you can imagine that DMT is that kind of message that's just embedded in our reality.
Yeah.
Again, pure speculation, but it's fun to think about.
It's fun to think about. And I think, you had a point as well in saying about the level of ingenuity required in order to unlock this kind of Easter egg that's maybe been embedded into our reality. And I think it's incredible that, for example, the natives of the Amazon, which is the most biodiverse region of our planet, managed to find the two plants in the jungle that need to be married together in order to produce ayahuasca.
Right, yeah. So this jungle technology.
Right.
And it is a form of technology.
Absolutely.
They developed it as a technology, and we're kind of picking up the mantle and you bringing our kind of best tools to the table as more kind of sophisticated Western scientists. And that's really what DMTX is also about as well, is treating molecule. I've always said it's more of a technology than a drug, DMT, and that we should we should use our best tools in learning how to use it, developing this as a technology. And so this intravenous infusion is all about that. I think it's being, it's honoring and respecting this molecule to actually treat it as a technology, to take these realms seriously, take these intelligences that are extant within these realms seriously. And I think it's much more respectful than just insisting that we continue with smoking it from pipes or continue, using ayahuasca. I think we have really wonderful advanced technology that we can bring to bear.
Well, this is kind of where and I've talked about this a lot on my channel in different ways about how, and my YouTube channel is called Project.Unity. The reason for that is I think there needs to be some form of a symbiosis between spirit and science, or logic and intuition, the analytical way of understanding the world, and the more intuitive or, dare I say, spiritual way of deriving meaning from the world. So I think that these two things do need to come together. And I think about the evolutionary journey of the human species, and for how so long we were a shamanistic species in many cultures all across the world. At the same time, we were very shamanistic. We've now moved into this more technologically orientated society. Both of these have their pros and cons, and perhaps we're coming to a point now where these two are meeting together. You've got a kind of a form of techno-shamanism where you're incorporating that ancient knowledge, you're bringing it back to the forefront, but you're using your newly learned technological prowess and analysis to dive a little deeper, to prolong the experience, to map it, to understand it. And I think that this is such a great example, specifically with DMT and the studies that are being done now, of this type of techno-shamanism where you're allowing both worlds to assist each other.
Yeah, absolutely. I think people have such a limited conception of what you might consider shamanism to be, and insist that, people always say to me, well, they've been using ayahuasca like this for thousands of years, this is how it should be done. It's like, no. Just because they've been using it like that for thousands of years doesn't mean that
that's the only way.
It's the only way to use it. It doesn't mean it's the correct way or best way, the optimal way. It's like they've reached the pinnacle of DMT administration technologies, 3,000 years ago, or however long it was.
Yeah.
I think it's not particularly diplomatic. I always say that insisting on particular ways of using DMT, particularly first of all, ayahuasca, it is a technology. You are extracting this molecule. It's a simple water-based extraction, but you're using a technology to extract the molecule, this basic chemistry. So what we're doing in the 21st century, since the 20th century, is using slightly more advanced technologies to extract DMT into a pure form. And that's basically what people do, or synthesize it even, but it's just chemistry. It's just a different type of more modern technology being brought and used in that regard with DMT. And so DMTX is just an extension of that. It's again drawing on our technologies. So I think to be a shaman, you don't have to be in the forest basically with a headdress and chanting or all of that. That's a different world, right? I think sometimes it feels wrong or unnatural to try and kind of transplant that. You can certainly learn, right? You can certainly learn from indigenous uses of DMT and the ritual and everything that goes along with these particular ceremonies. And, that can be so much you can learn from that, but that doesn't mean that we can't ourselves bring it out of the forest and
modernize it,
and make it more suitable for Western humans. And I think that's a perfectly good thing to do, and what we should be doing. In fact, that's how you respect this molecule. If you treat it as a technology, if you it isn't particularly respectful to burst into these domains, burst into these realms filled with these intelligences, look around wide-eyed for 5 minutes, and then bugger off again. That's kind of rude, right?
Right.
Living room whilst they're having their tea. They look at that, wow, aren't they strange, weird creatures, and then bugger off again. That's not particularly respectful or diplomatic. So I suggest extending it with this infusion technology it's interdimensional diplomacy.
Well, it's, you know, what's really interesting, because I mean, at one point I really did get into reading a lot of the DMT testimonies online and just hearing people's stories, and there was all sorts of forums where you could listen to people's stories. And one commonality, well, there were a few, but one that I noticed was that a lot of these entities that you encounter, not all of them, but a lot of these entities seem to be really happy you're there, as if it's like, well, about time, or thank God you're back, or like, you know, like, let me show you how to do this thing. Like, you can make a noise like this and a solid object is going to form. Like, you can manipulate matter like this. It's almost like it's quickly trying to tell you, like, hey, like, this is a lot of important information I've got to give you, and you're gonna go soon, but like, it's good to see you again. What's up with that? Yeah. What do you think's up with that?
Well, I mean, that's a very, very common experience. I mean, parents were getting used to talk about, oh, you come so rarely. It's
right.
Well, all that kind of stuff. He loved talking about that. You know, these machines welcoming him back, and it's a very, very, it's uncanny how common that is. And the sense people report that the entities seem to know that time is short. So they're, as you say, it's a rush. It's a mad rush. They're all bounding in to try and get your attention. And look at this, do this, hurry. You know, and it's interesting. One of Rick Strassman's subjects back in the 90s, her name, well, I don't know her real name. Her book name was Sarah, and she reported that the entities told her that they have so much they are going to be able to tell us or her once we learn how to spend more time within their realm. So that was back in the 90s. So there we go. That was that was kind of the precursor, if you like, or the impetus for that. In that we didn't have the technology then, right? But clearly, at least from that particular entity, or those particular entities that she met, there was a sense that we would be able to develop some kind of technology to spend more time within their domain. And that DMTX seems to be that technology. And it's probably no coincidence that it's Rick Strassman as well, together with myself, that actually developed that technology. So it's nice. It fits.
There's an argument some people would make, I suppose, so I might as well make it. Should we trust these entities? What are we doing exactly, connecting our bridge of consciousness to theirs, you know? Is this something we should be doing?
Well, nothing ventured, nothing gained. I mean, I think, one shouldn't be one can't assume that they're not going to fuck with you, basically. I don't think they can actually physically or in any other way actually really harm you. There's no evidence for that. People have been taking DMT for decades now.
And it's proven to be incredibly beneficial, even if the situations are intense. A lot of people derive a lot of positive change out of that stuff.
Exactly. Yeah. So certainly there's no shortage of, 90%. I mean, there's several recent studies suggest that around 90% of encounters are either positive or neutral. A lot of the time they just don't care that you're there. They don't pay any attention to you. Sometimes they, as you said, these elves, they come bounding in and they're very interested. Sometimes you have these kind of what seem like guardians or guides who want to kind of show you around. Often there's a very loving presence within the space, a very welcoming presence. And it's only a very small number that seem to be either visually objectionable or downright sort of malicious or mocking. Sometimes a lot of mocking that goes on.
Yeah, mocking is one that I've seen. Actually, I had someone on recently. Do you know who Duncan Trussell is?
I was on his podcast last year, yeah.
Oh, great. Yeah, I was on his not that long ago, and he came on for a chat, and we were talking about, psychedelic experiences. And I remember one of his DMT experiences where, he was taken to this incredible circuit board city and everything was amazing. And this kind of orb was telling him all of these different secrets of the universe. And then it said to him, like, do you really want to know what's going on? And he was like, yeah. And it was like, look over there. And he turns around and there's just like this cartoon trash can with like some sort of weird cartoon cat looking at him. And he turns back round to the orb and the orb just goes, I'm just fucking with you. And then he picks up and then he just, it's like, I can't understand what
Yeah.
the motives of this space are. Like, you get incredible spiritual insights, and then you just get an orb that just wants to fuck with you a little bit. So it's like, what a dynamic crowd out in the DMT space.
Oh yeah, I mean the whole space has this almost comic ambience.
Right.
Sometimes they like it's like they know that you're not that bright, relative to them, and that they can enjoy playing with you a little bit. And most of the time, it's kind of a bit. It seems to be playful, but sometimes it can be quite brutal. With serious mocking going on. I remember I was at Tyringham Hall. I won't tell you who this was for fear of embarrassing him. Well, it's a him, you know that now. But anyway, we were in so Tyringham Hall. Anton Bilton used to own Tyringham Hall, this beautiful stately home. And he had this beautiful temple, and he's got this Alex Gray painting like above the altar, or like an original Alex Gray. Amazing space.
I love that.
We all went in there. Yeah, we all went in there to do some DMT. And one of the guys, he took a hit and he laid down, and everyone was kind of on their back, like in the space. And suddenly he bolted up and started screaming, like, "Am I dead? Am I dead? Am I dead?" He like completely freaked out. And when he kind of calmed down and came back, he was telling us that there were these beings, he described them as like menacing, mocking triangle beings. They were all made them triangular, sharp, and they were mocking him in a way that he didn't think was possible. They were like penetrating deep down into his very soul, showing him how pathetic and worthless and stupid and dumb he was. He said it was the most appalling experience of his life. So, fortunately, these kind of events are quite rare, but they can happen. I mean, Graham Hancock as well has had a kind of famous trip report that he's told many times, where they say, "We've got you now," but he said, "And only for 15 minutes." He had his wherewithal,
I like that.
Exactly. Yeah,
I like that. It's scary though. I mean, it is scary because, is that just the set and the setting, or your own psychology, the fact that you had a bad week, or is this something a little deeper and darker? And if these are real intelligences, if we're going to say that these amazing entities that give us knowledge and give us insight could potentially be real, then so are those demonic little triangle bastards.
Yeah, of course.
I
don't think we can assume that a vast hyperdimensional ecology of extremely cognitively and technologically sophisticated beings would all be love and light.
Right.
I think they would vary in as much, and perhaps even more dramatically, in their character and in their intent, as we do. I mean, we have some pretty nasty people on Earth, pretty unpleasant people, or just some cruel people who enjoy, kind of sadistic people who enjoy taking the piss, or worse, mocking people. So it's perhaps not that surprising.
And to be honest, like you said about higher dimensional, if and talking in these speculations, if that is a higher dimensional slice of our own reality, then things like these triangle entities, the humans who act cruel are like a lower dimensional slice of that type of perhaps energetic influence. And so it's almost the same character projected as a human being. You go back up to the source point, it's this creepy little triangle slapping you in the ribs and calling you names, We've wandered deep into the desert of speculation here, but that's what I like. I mean, I think you're forced to with something as profound as DMT, because it's not a normal situation. It's not a normal landscape. You are talking about infinite and abstract. So you have to get pretty abstract with the philosophy and speculation around it, because the implications of it are pretty incredible, especially if it turns out to be a real dimensional space. I mean, that, like you said, is one of the biggest catalytic game changers for humanity, to learn that there are, interdimensional or higher dimensional spaces that are completely full of intelligent life.
Yeah, I think it's kind of, to repeat myself, there would be nothing in our history that would compare or prepare us for that.
Mm-hmm.
Compared to anything in our past, compared to anything we're expecting in the future. I mean, we're almost kind of to some extent psychologically and socially prepared for alien contact, right?
Yeah.
In recent years, the idea that we might be in touch with beings from elsewhere in the universe, but I don't think anyone's taken seriously or being able to kind of comprehend what it would involve, or what that would be like to definitively establish that there are beings that not just that exist in some other dimension, but with which we can communicate with such facility as inhaling a couple of lungfuls of one of the most common and simplest plant alkaloids in the world. I mean, it's unbelievable, you know. It's hard to put into words.
Well, maybe the kind of quote unquote prosaic alien disclosure process that's coming out through the government right now is the precursor towards us understanding higher dimensional landscapes, and that type of ontological shock might be easier to deal with if we already have this understanded basis of, well, there's life out there in the universe, just in the wider spatial universe. And I still have my suspicions that that particular subject of UFOs does have a significant bleed over into the psychedelic space, into the transcendental space, and I don't think they're necessarily completely separate subjects, to be honest. It's just difficult for people to see that unless they dive deep enough. But as someone who has done quite a bit of research into the UFO subject, I mean, I've got friends, for example, a man called Nick Cook. He was a former editor for Jane's Defense Weekly. He's an author. He was very nuts and bolts orientated through his career and kind of like defense orientated. Became a UFO researcher and kind of really was on that whole nuts and bolts side of it, and the craft and the vehicles. And now he's sitting on the board of Institute for Consciousness Studies for Robert Bigelow, and he completely is immersed in this whole idea of, hang on a second, there is a consciousness element to this that goes a lot deeper than just physical reality. So again, it just seems inescapable when you start tugging on these threads in different subjects like UFOs. They lead towards the same kind of avenue as psychedelics. So I think there's a shared space there.
Oh, I agree. It feels like you have two seemingly independent threads that are actually converging, and where they meet, and they could meet pretty soon. I don't think we're necessarily far off. These things aren't always linear, so we could be at the kind of the base is where that exponential curve kind of starts to shoot up,
right?
And we can't imagine. I said on Duncan Trussell's podcast that these intelligence that we meet in the DMT space might be us 5 years down the line, right? Because these things happen so quickly. We don't have to imagine they're a million years more advanced. These things, we have no idea what we're going to look like in, certainly in sort of 1,000 years or something. And it could be much shorter than that. Mm-hmm. Perhaps we deal with, alien beings from 2030. But no, I mean, it's that extreme, but you never know.
No, for sure. Because just bringing us briefly back to what we were saying about the potential for like a post-singularity type of civilization that we're interfacing with. If this is humans after we've crossed over the event horizon of some sort of incredible technological quantum conscious leap, then perhaps we are actually experiencing a pretty not far away echo of our human potential being demonstrated through these types of things. And I've spoken with people in the AI industry. I've had people on who are CEOs in the AI industry, and this is something that's exponentially accelerating at a point where they can barely even understand how it's becoming so sophisticated so quickly. So, some of the more conservative projections for some form of a singularity, the timeline is actually reducing almost month by month at this point. I think we're in an extremely novel kind of moment in human evolution. I mean, of course, each generation does have that feeling of we're on the edge of major change, and there have been major checkpoints throughout humanity. But I do feel like right now, with the amalgamation of AI and quantum computation, and then obviously psychedelic study, refining our models for consciousness, just feels like we're on the precipice. And then outside of that, just the fact that society in different ways is either falling apart or radically changing, and there's just a lot of disruption and turbulence and momentum right now. And it just makes me think that, we could be in a pretty significant moment in human history, actually.
Yeah, well, Terence was saying this back in the 90s that this is what happened.
You'd have been like, "It's the eschaton. I told you, it's the eschaton. It's coming over the hill right now."
Well, that's it. He always said this is what it's like. A species sets to gets
Travel
ready
among the stars and
intergalactic citizenship. This is what it's like. It's turbulent time.
One of my favorite quotes from Terence was that the story of the human species is the story of the monkey becoming the flying saucer. I thought.
Well, there you go. I mean, that seems to be, we're certainly closer to the flying saucer now than we are to the monkey in the trees.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, who knows what the next decade is going to look like.
Absolutely. How are you doing for time? Do you have much more? I know I'm eating into your evening a little bit.
No, it's fine. I know. We're good.
Okay, great. Do you think it's possible that one of the reasons why psychedelics have undergone so much vilification is precisely because of their powerful ability to inject curiosity and expansive ideas into someone's consciousness, that it's the very act of expanding one's consciousness, expanding one's sense of reality, one's sense of connectivity? This can create a very dangerous scenario for those who are in the business of shepherding the human race and keeping us as valuable assets to their system. Without going into too big of a conspiracy over it, one of the consequences of a lot of psychedelic taking is a lot of people are just going to go, I don't want to deal with your system of bullshit anymore. And we saw this in the 70s, the hippie movement, and suddenly people didn't want to go to Vietnam and the government was panicking. So is this one of the reasons that, in all honesty, it makes it easier to control people?
Well, I think certainly, certainly in the 1960s, that was clearly what was going on. I mean, people were taking acid and smoking pot, marijuana, and they were basically dropping out. They were acting out Timothy Leary's exhortation to turn on, tune in, and drop out. Right? They were checking out of society. They were, they didn't want to be involved with Vietnam, and they were clearly falling away from what was considered the desirable social order. And so that, I don't have any doubt that was why LSD particularly was thought to be so dangerous. In the modern world, there might still be some echoes of that. But I think it's, what is it? You shouldn't, what's the phrase? Don't put down to malice what could more easily be explained as stupidity.
As stupidity. Yeah. It's something along those lines. I know what you're saying.
Yeah. I think, we've been in this same track of, the war on drugs and prohibition and criminalization, lumping all drugs together. I think a lot of it is just ignorance and inability to see drugs or to differentiate between different types of drugs and to understand each drug on its own terms. And I think that's just ignorance and stupidity from the kind of the older generation. But I think that's changing. It's changing. Certainly in terms of clinical uses of psychedelics, it's much more accepted now in many areas of the world. So, but I still think we're some way away. I mean, even in certain states of the US, of course, it's legal now. Colorado, I think, for example.
Yeah, they're kind of leading the charge.
They're leading the charge, and in the Netherlands as well, Portugal. So you're starting to see certain more progressive governments breaking away from this kind of old, tired, failed approach, prohibition and criminalization approach to drugs.
Not so much in the UK, huh?
No, well, of course not. No, I mean, the UK is as bad as Japan in many respects, in that they are kind of set in their ways,
very set in their ways,
resistant to change. But psychedelics are very democratic. They are to some extent they are immune to many kind of prohibition policies. You can't. It's not like with cocaine where you can stop it at the border. If you manage to intercept all of the cocaine being brought from South America, then you can cut off the supply. But with something like magic mushrooms, for example, which anyone can share spores. Produce.
I mean, we've got liberty caps growing all over this country. Can't
exactly. So there are, hundreds of these species growing wild. It's very easy to cultivate them now. DMT as well. It's very easy to extract it from various quite common plant sources now, and people have become very proficient at that. So these drugs are naturally resistant to these kind of authoritarian prohibitionary kind of policies of government. So that's kind of nice.
Which is also kind of funny, since they actually stoke that in terms of your own mindset. So they're physically quite anti-authoritarian because they'll grow no matter what you do, and they will give you anti-authoritarian perspectives. If you take them and start looking at the system and how the system treats these types of compounds, you start becoming pretty suspicious of the reasons. And, without, like we were just saying earlier, without invoking like a kind of shadowy cabal trying to control the minds of people, I think at least to a certain extent, the pharmaceutical industry might be viewing this with a level of concern, just because of the reduction of repeatability of access to customer base. Because, you have something that can literally alleviate PTSD or anxiety or depression in a couple of sessions. No, you've just lost a pretty valuable customer. And obviously there's incredible people in the medicinal and pharmacological industry, but there is a capitalistic bent to Big Pharma, and perhaps there are concerns that this is going to detract from a lot of their money making.
Oh, I mean, without a doubt. I mean, obviously there is as you say, there's a huge financial element to, Big Pharma, as they call it. And to a certain extent, that's sort of inevitable, because to generate a new drug, discover a new drug, it requires, people don't realize, the millions and millions,
huge amounts of funding.
Exactly, of research and development, and all these failures, out of every, one in a very large number of actual kind of drug leads actually make it to market. And so you waste enormous amounts of money, in a sense, to find this one drug that might make it to market, and then you have to kind of make your money back. Otherwise, there's no incentive to do the research, and so you can't get away from the fact that people need that kind of carrot, if you like, in order to kind of to provide that incentive for drug development. So there's that side of it. But of course, yes, you want your patients to be taking your drug for as long as possible, really. To put it kind of not too fine a point on it. You don't want them taking it once and then being cured. You want them to be taking it every day, 3 times a day for the next 5 years. That's much better. And they were getting that with SSRIs, for example.
Yeah, which came under fire, didn't they, recently? I mean, SSRIs were proven to basically be completely worthless, if I remember correctly. That came out not that long ago.
Well, okay, that's a little bit contentious. I mean, there's certainly been some kind of
it was the serotonin connection, right? The
serotonin connection.
Yeah.
I think the problem is that a lot of people misunderstood what the role or the mechanism of SSRI. So they raise serotonin levels in your brain. But they do that within a few hours. That's not their primary mechanism of effect. Over time, raising serotonin levels actually causes changes in receptor expression. It causes basically plastic changes in the brain.
Right.
That's most likely to be the effect. So it's not that it's just raising serotonin. So SSRIs, many people find benefit in them, as with other types of antidepressants. You can't deny that many people have found relief with these, but they have side effects. You have to take them continuously. They're not kind of a cure. They treat the condition to some extent. They treat the symptoms of the condition. They don't get down to the root of the problem. Whereas psychedelics, it seems to be attacking the actual cause of the depression. These ingrained neural patterns, these negative thought patterns, which are instantiated in these kind of ingrained loops or networks in the brain that are developed over many, many years. And when psychedelics get in there, they break those networks down, they loosen up, they put the brain into a much more kind of fluid and plastic state, which allows you then to adopt a more positive pattern activity, which then is like heating up glass and then molding it into a more desirable shape, and then letting it cool again. It's that kind of principle. So you're attacking the problem right at the root cause, which is why you don't need to be taking, psilocybin every day. You have 1, 2, 3 sessions, deep sessions for a few hours, and then you get sustained benefits. So, yeah, remarkable.
Yeah, I mean, it is remarkable, and I think again it kind of throws back to experience being one of the greatest teachers and accelerants, like self-realization. Yeah, it's fantastic having psychotherapy and having someone able to unlock the things that you didn't really know about yourself. But I think what psychedelics can do, and I've certainly had experience with this on something like psilocybin, is that it can put you into a very interesting state of consciousness where you're able to observe your own behavior or look at some of your own memories and analyze it. And I mean, I remember at a friend's house when we'd, taken some mushrooms, and I was just lying on the sofa and had my eyes closed and just had a level of clarity when assessing my own life that I've never really had before. I was like, I really shouldn't be doing that, should I? I should have really changed that by now, and I haven't. Let's stop doing that. The next day you wake up and you have no desire to do whatever it was you decided you shouldn't be doing. And so that's an extremely powerful thing, because I think it talks about how the realization within your own self has such a neural plastic effect on the brain, because it's you coming to a decision, it's you coming to a choice. And so I think that sometimes it's that level of self-realization that is the ultimate kind of accelerant, and psychedelics give you that more than sitting down with a therapist, although that can be extremely beneficial in tandem with psychedelics, which is starting to happen as well.
Yeah, exactly. And they knew this back in the 50s,
right,
when LSD was being trialed for alcoholism. They realized that it had these potentially extremely valuable in treatment of this type of addiction, and no doubt other types of addiction as well. So again, you have to ask yourself where we would be now if this kind of research had continued from the 50s to the modern era. We might be in a world where, without depression, without anxiety disorders, without post-traumatic stress disorder, and all these things, and they might be very easily treatable. But unfortunately, we just have to work with where we are now.
Which is true. I think I maybe I'd spend too much time in conspiracy circles, because the only thing I could think of then was and one of the byproducts of there still being anxiety and depression and all of this kind of high energy is people are pretty easy to manipulate through the media and through everything that we're absorbing in our culture. And so even if there isn't some form of sinister cabal, it certainly lays the groundwork for such a cabal to operate when you have a lack of conscious expanding abilities and an overindulgence of anxiety and fast-acting media and 24-hour news cycles. We're living in a society that kind of keeps us in that very high-level, free-floating anxiety type of situation. And so even if that's not purposeful, it's certainly impacting the way that our collective consciousness is responding.
Absolutely, yeah. I think you're absolutely right there. And I think as psychedelics become more and more acceptable, perhaps there's a possibility that might change, for better or worse, depending on your perspective, I guess.
Before you leave, what does the future of psychedelic research look like right now? And is there anything that you're working on in particular that you'd like to highlight?
Oh, that's a good question. I mean, aside from the clinical aspects, and I think you're going to see within the next decade you're already starting to see these kind of psychedelic clinics popping up now in certain parts of the world, and psychedelic treatment centers. I think it's going to revolutionize. Ideally, it's going to revolutionize psychiatric treatment in the countries that are actually promoting it, such as the United States, and eventually it will get to the point, I think, where any country that isn't using psychedelics in psychiatry would be kind of like a state that wasn't using penicillin,
right?
By the 1950s or something, right? It would be unthinkable,
right?
So we're not going to use penicillin. We're going to stick to our old drugs. I mean, that would be ridiculous, of course. But I think psychedelics would have such an influence on psychiatry. They would be shown to be such revolutionary treatments that it would be absurd for any state to not be using psychedelics. And so that would be the catalyst, I think, through which it kind of spread globally, and every country in the world would, in the next maybe 10 years is optimistic, but certainly not too distant future, where psychedelics are being used routinely as the kind of the primary treatment for various neuropsychological conditions, and no doubt it will be adapted for different conditions. So I think it sounds like it could be a very bright future in that regard, because the human cost and the suffering cost, if you like, of these various conditions is enormous, and not just depression and kind of clinical conditions, but also just general feelings of hopelessness and meaninglessness.
Yeah,
that makes.
I think that tracks.
That sense of a kind of lack of meaning in your life.
Yeah.
What are we? Who are we? Fear of death. All of these things that are we consider to be kind of fundamental and basic things we have to deal with. We have to deal with the fact that we don't really know our place within reality, and that we don't know where we're going. We don't know if there's life after death. All these things, this kind of natural human angst and fear and apprehension, you can imagine those being kind of gradually dissolved away when we start to realize our place within a larger reality. And certainly with DMT, that kind of dovetails with that, in that if we are discovering that in fact there is some discarnate intelligence elsewhere that has this deep relationship with our reality in a way that we don't understand yet, you can imagine that also, of course, massively broadening our perspective. So we stop being this kind of frightened little monkey, frightened in our own heads, frightened of our own existence in a sense, and our future apparent ostensible non-existence when we die. All of those things start to be dissolved by psychedelics, and we realize actually that we are part of this grand cosmic drama, as Alan Watts used to call it, and that it's all one wonderful game that we're playing, and that we don't need to worry too much because we get to play the game in some other domain, perhaps.
Right.
And we pass on to the other side. That's a game. It's hard to imagine what a world like that would look like, where everyone was just enjoying their life, enjoying their little time with, their 70 years and 10 or whatever it is within this little game, and realizing that it's short-lived, but it's a fun game, and that at the end of it, there's something wonderful waiting for us and some new game to play at the end of it. So that's what I think psychedelics are doing. It's all part of. There's not this dichotomy between the clinical and the existential, but actually it's all part of one process of dissolving all of these anxieties and fears and apprehensions and all that stuff, and becoming part of this broader, wonderful, beautiful, complex, strange reality that we find ourselves within.
That was wonderfully put. Have you been on Joe Rogan yet?
Not yet.
Someone get this man on Joe Rogan. He needs to be on there. I mean, he would love talking to you. That's for sure. I've loved talking to you. This has been great. I would love to do this again, because I just feel like there's a lot of philosophical avenues that we could have fallen down for a couple more hours. So perhaps we can reschedule another talk somewhere down the line.
Absolutely, yes. No problem.